Don't forget to give a thumbs up and provide a comment, and subscribe if you'd like to see more of this content. My next project is not going to be on the lathe, but rather my son is getting married later this summer. So as part of the wedding decorations, they wanted the wooden discs to put on the table as centerpieces. So I have a log here that we cut off of his fiance's property. It's a poplar log. It's about 12 inches, 10 to 12 inches in diameter. I cut them up into manageable sections, cut them up in the fall, sealed the ends of them with melted wax to prevent the ends from cracking. Then I made this jig, turn it around here, to allow me to cut off uniform discs with my chainsaw. So I'm just going to put my chainsaw in here and then pass it down through. I've got a stop block here in the end, so I'll square it up and then slide the log ahead till it hits the stop block, and then just continue to cut discs off. The disc thickness are about 1.5 inches, so that will allow me again to cut some uniform discs. And then we'll talk about how I draw them in a second. Like I said, I just square up that first one to get rid of, you see it wasn't very square. So square it up, so now I have a good edge to work with, and then I'll continue to cut the discs. I'll go ahead and measure the moisture on that. So again, these were cut last fall. But you can see it's still very wet because again I had sealed the ends up. So that's 30%. If I left that just like that, it would crack in a matter of a few hours. So I'm going to have to further treat it from here. There's my first disc, fairly uniform. I've got a thickness sander. I'll straighten those out a little bit further, but they're fairly uniform in thickness. Last piece was a little too short, so it ended up moving on me, so I won't keep this piece. It's a little too non-uniform. That'll be a lot to sand down. Out of that piece, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 discs of that short piece. I only need a total of 20. I already have 2 from the previous one, and I've got 2 more logs left. So I'll call that good out of that log. So here's the 7 discs I cut out of that log. Again, I measured the moisture on those around 30%. So I'm going to have to get these into a plastic bag fairly quickly because they will crack in a matter of a few hours. So the next step that I do in the process is I've got a plastic tub and I've got methyl hydrate. So I'm going to pour the methyl hydrate in the tub and then put the discs in there to soak. Now there are multiple ways of doing this. You could just wait for years 8 years for that log to dry. They say about a year per inch of diameter. Now they'll dry maybe, if I had to let it log climb. So again, that means it would take about 8 years for that to dry. My son's getting married this summer, so I don't have 8 years. One way of speeding that up is to soak the wood in methyl hydrate. What methyl hydrate does is it will displace the water that's in the wood with methyl hydrate, which just helps relieve some of the tension in the wood, the stresses. And then the methyl hydrate will dry fairly quickly. So initially, when I got lots of methyl hydrate, I can put 2 in here. Later on, as it evaporates and soaks into the wood, I'll only be able to put 1 in. So what I do is for about a week, 5 days, I'll flip them over every day. I take a paintbrush here and just brush the surface that's outside of the methyl hydrate and keep it wet. And once a day I flip them over so that they get a good soaking. Put a cover over it to prevent evaporation, to minimize it, and like I say, they'll stay in there for about 5 days. And then once that dries, once it comes out, they'll dry fairly quickly. And then the next part of the process is I've made myself a thickness sander. I'll show you that here in a second. So, I apologize for the camera work, but this is my homemade thickness sander. It's a drum sander. It's meant to go into my lathe. I'll show you what that looks like here. So I didn't point it out, but on the bottom of this, I've got 2 pieces of plywood, and on the bottom I cut myself, you can just see it here, a piece that fits between the rails on my lathe, so that fits in between there, which holds that in place. This is got a hinge on the front, a piano hinge, and then on the back I've got a carriage bolt that I just adjust to raise or lower, which will raise and lower this relative to the drum. Now I'll show you the drum. So here's the drum I manufactured. I just made it out of pieces of plywood, squares, that I cut, and then I glued them all up. So they're 1/2-inch plywood there. It's about 18 inches long, so there's 36 pieces of plywood squares that are glued up, laminated together. And this is a live center that I had, that the tip of it had worn off completely, used for a long time. So it still had a bearing on it that was in good shape. So I just epoxied that into my tube, into my plywood tube. So that gets mounted in my lathe, so I now have a bearing, a live center bearing on it. And this is my drum. So I showed you earlier the mechanism to raise and lower it. With the lathe turning, put my piece in this side, and it's turning this way, so I'm pushing, it's actually turning this way, so I'm pushing against it. And yeah, that gives me a parallel sanding. I should mention what I did before I mounted the sandpaper onto the drum. What I did is, with this setup, I put sandpaper on the plywood here and brought it up till it touched the drum, and that way I trued the drum up so that the drum is parallel to the bed of the thickness sander. So I just passed a piece of sandpaper under here, so that, very critical, that this drum is parallel to this surface. So that gave me a parallel surface, and now I've got myself a thickness sander. So that's how I just even those discs up. Here is a finished product. So this is after I passed it through the thickness sander, so it's nice and uniform now. It just took care of any variations I had from chainsawing it, and got rid of any chainsaw marks that were visible initially from the chainsaw. And this still wasn't dry. It was about 20% moisture, still in the danger zone as far as cracking. You'd have to get it down below 10 before it would stop cracking, preferably even 5. But what I did was I put polyurethane on it, Polyurethane will significantly slow the moisture down, and that's really what causes the cracks, moisture just escaping too quickly. So I put polyurethane on it to slow it down, which hopefully that'll prevent the cracks, just because I don't have 8 years to wait. Here's another disc that was cut at the same time, brought down to the same level of moisture, and it cracked, so it's not a foolproof method. There was some structural weaknesses, I think, in this disc to start with. There was a crack right here, and almost right away, even after putting the polyurethane on it, it started to develop a small crack. I glued it to try and hold it, but another crack developed overnight. So this, even though I put polyurethane on it, within a few hours it started to crack. This guy's been over 24 and I see no signs of cracking, so hopefully that one will be okay. But this is the finished product, and like I say, that's going to be a centerpiece on the wedding tables. So these discs that have been cut, so this is pre-going into the thickness sander that I showed you. So you can see there are some chainsaw marks. It's relatively smooth, but you can see them. And just to prevent these from cracking, I'll put those in a plastic bag. If you just stop the moisture, then or slow it down significantly, then it should prevent the cracks. Here's a methyl hydrate that I mentioned. I just bought that at my local Canadian Tire store, and it's about $12 for 4 liters. The other thing I do, after I take them out of the methyl hydrate, walk over here, excuse the chainsaw shavings, but what I do with the shavings is I put them in a bag and I bury the discs. When they come out of the methyl hydrate, I bury them in here, and I'll leave them in here for about a month. So this is April, the wedding's in July. I'll leave them in here for a month or two. And again, the moisture they'll still dry, but dry very slowly. So I just pack them in the sawdust, and sawdust, again, just slows the rate of moisture escaping down significantly. So that's the final product for this week. It's not a lathe work, although I did do some work on the lathe, as I mentioned earlier, but that is the finished product. So hopefully I'll end up with 20 of these for my son's wedding. If you have any questions, you can put a comment in the video and I will answer them the best that I can. And for anyone else that's interested in making these and you have any questions, just let me know. Thank you.